Hello, everybody. Bienvenidos. Welcome to this latest Alborada online talk. My name is Pablo Navarrete, or in English, Pablo Navarrete. I'm one of the two co-editors of Alborada, alongside Nick McWilliam, who's in the background tonight, making sure the music works and everything goes smoothly. Just to say, we are recording this event. We'll be releasing it on Saturday or over the weekend on our website and on our social media channels. So if you won't be on the recording, but we have a system. Well, I'll explain it now. We have our three speakers who I'll introduce in a minute, and I also have a co-chair with me, Rachel Boothroyd, who's an Alborada contributing editor, someone that I've had the pleasure of working with on documentaries in Latin America. And so we'll be sort of hosting the discussion quite informally with our three great speakers. And the idea is to kind of talk to them until a bit after 8 o'clock, and then have a good amount of time for questions from you guys. And for that, we're asking for you to put comments in the chat. You can either do it to everyone, or you can direct them to me or to Rachel. Sorry, we didn't probably think about that, to either of us. And then if you want to read your question or say it to camera, we can do that. If you just make sure that you specify that, but be aware that if you do that, you will be recorded. So if for whatever reason you don't want to be on camera, best to let us read it. So just quickly, for those of you that don't know Alborada, we're an independent website that for over 10 years has been putting out information on Latin America, politics, media, and culture. And essentially, we try to put forward visions or narratives that challenge mainstream ones, be they academic, journalistic ones on the region. So we, since actually the pandemic, we've begun this series of online events. This is our 14th or 15th. I'll put a link later to the full sort of list so you can have a look. We have an e-newsletter. I'll also add a link to that. You can sign up, and we'll be doing more of these. And we'll do in-person events. We're based in the UK, so many of you will know that's where we predominantly do things. Just quickly to say thank you to the organizations that have helped spread the word. Red Pepper magazine, an independent British left-wing magazine that I have a long relationship with, and the Progressive International, a relatively new global socialist think tank that Alborada is very happy to be a partner of. And they have electoral observers in Chile, and they've just launched an electoral observatory kind of unit. So we'll also put links to their websites so you can see what they do. Thanks also to Chile Solidarity Network and to the Asamblea Chilena in London for helping to spread the word. This is a critical time in Chilean politics. I'm going to let Rachel do a very brief sort of history of how we got to these Chilean elections from, I guess, 2019 to keep it manageable. But yeah, I think I'll quickly just say that the three speakers that we're lucky to have today, in the order that they will speak, are Melanie Cruz, lecturer in politics based at Leicester. We have Roberto Navarrete, an exile, UK-based, who also made a film for Alborada Films called Chile Student Uprising, which we'll also add a link to because you can watch that online, about the 2011-2012 student uprisings. And then we have Boris van der Spek, editor of Chile Now News, based in Chile. So we have two Chileans in the UK and a Dutch guy based in Chile. So we're very, very we're very transnational tonight. So yeah, I don't want to go on. I'm going to leave you with Rachel, and then thanks a lot for coming, and don't be shy to put your questions in the comments, and let's make the discussion as fruitful as possible. Thanks.
So hi everyone, and big thanks to our three speakers for being here tonight. as Pablo says, we are going to discuss what's going on in Chile following the results of the first round of the country's presidential elections on November 21st. And I'm going to try and contextualize very, very quickly kind of what's led us to this point. Quite surprisingly, on the 21st, we saw the ultra-right wing politician and leader of the Republican Party, Jose Antonio Cast, come in first place with almost 28% of the votes, and he beat Gabriel Boric, who's the candidate of the broad left coalition Apruebo Dignidad, and he finished with just under 26% of the vote. So not a lot in it, but still Cast came in first, and we'll talk a bit more about him later. Now, I say this was a bit of a surprise vote because result because Chile has been a source of inspiration and hope for the left for the past couple of years, and particularly since we saw the mass uprising led by the country's youth at the end of 2019, when there were massive street demonstrations against the high levels of social inequality in Chile. And this movement ultimately coalesced around the demand to rewrite the country's constitution, which, although has been amended several times, is still basically a legacy of the US-backed Augusto Pinochet dictatorship, which came to power in Chile in 1973 by overthrowing the socialist and democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. And this coup ushered in years of authoritarianism in Chile and persecution of the left, and also established a particularly cruel and unequal form of neoliberalism, which again is still intact in the country and was also the target of these demonstrations. So this is what the constitution represents for a lot of people in Chile. And this demand to rewrite it was put to the Chilean people in a referendum in 2020. And not only did they approve the rewrite en masse, but they also elected mostly independent candidates and progressive forces really to do that rewrite. So it's quite a watershed moment in Chile's modern history. And so given this backdrop, I think, you know, the left had reason to have quite high hopes for these presidential elections, and has been on what you could call an upward trajectory since 2019. Cast, on the other hand, is the total antithesis of the aspirations of the 2019 protest movement. He has defended the Pinochet dictatorship. His brother was, in fact, a minister for Pinochet and a member of the infamous Chicago Boys. And his father was a German Nazi officer as well. And he has stood on this quite, unfortunately, quite familiar ultra-right platform, being pro-security, pro the nuclear hetero family, and very anti-immigration, which unfortunately probably does sound quite familiar to some of us here in Europe and no doubt in the US. So this has been quite an alarming setback for the left, which is going to be the focus of our discussion tonight. Melanie, if I could come to you first, hello. You wrote an article recently in Tribune, which was really great on the results of the election. And I think you said something along the lines of that the left has been unable to capitalize sufficiently on the energy that that was kind of channeled through this huge protest movement. Is that the main factor at play here, or how would you otherwise explain these results?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to Alborada for having me tonight as well. Can you hear me well? Is that okay? Yeah, great, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think there is one factor, and to start with the negative first. We need to think a little bit from where this started. I mean, Boric, the candidate, the left-wing candidate or the progressive candidate, was elected in a primary in April against the communist candidate, Daniel Jadwe, who lost that primary. According to the numbers that same Boric was talking about yesterday, he didn't grow much from the vote he got in the primaries to the ones who got now in the election. And that were 4 months in which we didn't see a growing numbers of voters coming out for him or for Apruebo Dignidad, which is the coalition and which also involved the Communist Party in it. So that's a first question or something to think about, and how the program is being communicated to society as a whole, but how some of the questions that the other candidate, Kast, is addressing that could be appealing for Chilean society. These are, for example, security, and not in the lines of order, law and order, but necessarily, but security, an extension of criminality, obviously poor dealing with narco traffic in certain areas of the country, which are real social problems and real social issues that the left program hasn't been really focused on. And through fear, obviously, by inferring fears to the society, we see how Kast has gained a lot of those votes from there. But it's also important to see there is still a 52% of the population, or the voting population, that didn't come out that on Sunday. So I think for the left is to think where those people are, why they haven't been able to communicate those ideas and those the program in general through all the groups, right? Not just because I don't think we can appeal to the voters of Kast. That's kind of like a clear-cut division. But for me, it's been also very interesting to see who came third or in this election, which is a businessman, a populist, someone who ran his entire campaign apparently from the United States, and who doesn't have any political platform. He doesn't belong to any political party, but he was responding to something that also emerged from the social uprising, or the 2019 social uprising, which is an anti-establishment, an anti-political party, an anti-traditional political parties sentiment. And I think that is also very key. I think there is still a fear that any coalition, either left or right, and this sort of like very simplistic dichotomies, because I wouldn't express that the left has a very like radical program. Is a very, very inclusive, very based on social justice program, but definitely people see it as an extreme version of the left, and to think about how they feed into as well the establishment. So in a way, I think there's several questions that we can discuss today. For me, I think are important. What are those sentiments that grow out of the uprising? Are they all progressive sentiments? Are all things that are focused on improving society, or they also just sentiments of anger against the establishment, against the elites, and how, for example, Kast ironically represent those sentiments, or and as well how the left have communicated and are able to channel those sentiments. So I think those are two elements I think we can pay attention to. That's just say the negative stuff. Of course, we've seen in the last few days a positive development with this. I'm not saying that we can predict what's going to happen on the 19th of December, but definitely we have seen a much more vocal support of the coalition Aprobemos Dignidad from trade unions, from social organizations, like, for example, Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, which is a feminist kind of autonomous organization, had a big assembly yesterday. Over 1,000 people joined on Zoom, and they had hundreds of people joining in person in Santiago, which respond to an attempt to organize people who were probably not so happy with Boric being their candidate in the first place, but now they're going to join forces to campaign for him. So yes, we can see how this could go, but I wouldn't dare myself to predict anything yet.
Well, thanks, Melanie. Roberto, if I could just bring you in on quite a similar question. So Melanie's talking about some of the organisations, and I think even some of the kind of the mainstream political parties, such as Provoste from the Christian Democrat Party, who ran, you know, as well as trade unions, they've now thrown their weight behind Boric, which they haven't done till now. So what do you think the prospects are for the left? Is that going to be enough to turn this round in December?
That's a $1 million question, as they say. It's going to be very, very hardly contested second round. So far, the right wing has perhaps a slight advantage if we consider a kind of photographic image of what happened in the first round. But one very important thing, as Melanie mentioned, is the high rate of abstention in Chile. And that tends to involve mainly both the young people and people who live in poor neighborhoods and are, in fact, very, very angry with the political system. In fact, if you look, and I think Nick McWilliams' film on the estallido, it shows it very clearly in graphic form. If you look at the protest in 2019, there were no banners, and certainly no banners of political parties of the left or of the right. And that shows that people did not allow these banners to be used. I mean, people rejected all banners of that kind, whereas you could wear a banner of your favorite football club, for example, but not the banners of political parties. And unfortunately, although it is, in my opinion, a little bit unfair, because it included the left in that kind of category. And I say unfair because I was filming in 2011 during the first student uprising, and without a continuous work by the left throughout the post-dictatorship period, there would not have been a movement, a student movement in 2011, or a estallido social in 2019. Although I'm not saying that it was the left parties that provoked these two issues, but it was essential for this organizational element to be present throughout. I would say the dictatorship. I mean, I am from a generation of people who lived through the dictatorship, and as an exile mostly, but I also was underground in Chile during the first 2 years of the dictatorship. And it was the left that maintained the flame of resistance against the first onslaught of neoliberalism during the Pinochet regime. And the second half, it was mostly against the left that the Concertación created this kind of 30 years of post-dictatorship in which there were undoubtedly positive changes in economic, and in the country grew in many respects, but with an exclusion of large parts of the population from this process. So we come now, and I think if we look at any social process, you have this counter-reaction or counter-revolutions following the revolution, and we're witnessing that kind of situation now. I think we are obviously, there has been also some excesses, quotes, of the left, etc. You know, there's been some violence, sometimes uncontrolled violence, but it is a part of any process that is not controlled by any center. I mean, this is particularly clear in 2019. There was no coordinating center for this uprising, for this estallido. And so coming back to the question of the second round and the difficulty for the left to bring together all these different strands, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, it's one positive thing is that the students who now largely are around Boric, which form part of the Frente Amplio, were very critical of the center-left parties that ruled Chile for 30 years. And in this process of criticism, there were a lot of harsh words said. And so for them, for the center-left parties to come and vote for Boric is a little bit difficult, particularly for the Christian Democrats, who during the second government of Michelle Bachelet, where there was a majority in parliament to enact many changes, it was mainly the Christian Democrats, the center and the right wing of the Christian Democrats that did not actually provide their votes for the changes that were. And in some ways, this is, and I'm going to finish with this, is something that from my point of view, explains what people used to say is that we didn't see it coming. Well, there were possibilities for the establishment, including the center-left establishment, to produce the changes that would have prevented the estallido social had they used the opportunity that they had in government in the second half. So a lot of the problems that we are seeing today are resulting from that kind of difficult confrontation between the forces that felt that politicians failed them and ordinary people failed them in these 30 years.
Thanks, Roberta. That's really interesting. I think we'll have to talk about that a bit later, about that transition from street movement to elections, when those street, like you were talking about, where you have a street movement that is quite distrustful of traditional left parties, etc. So maybe that's something we can talk a bit about later. Boris, I'd love to get your opinion on this, because I think you tweeted a fact either earlier on today or yesterday where you said that historically in Chile, the candidate who's won the first round has always gone on to win the presidency. Now, did you tweet that because you think that's going to be the case now in these elections, or do you think there's still a possibility that the left can actually go on to win the presidency?
Well, the reason I tweeted that was, of course, not in the history. It was until 1999 when Lagos beat Lavín. But the reason I do tweeted that is also because I think that the chances for Boric are quite, well, I won't say slim, but it's going to be really hard for Boric to become president of Chile. Like Roberto said, the right is in an advantage at this moment. And that has everything to do with the campaign the two candidates are running. José Antonio Cast doesn't need to change too much about the things he has been saying. He has already got the support of the center-right, and some of the key voters will be those that voted Franco Parisi, who came in third on the Sunday elections, and they're more likely to go towards Cast than towards Boric. On the other side, Boric has a huge challenge because, first of all, he has a shaky alliance with the Communist Party, because the Frente Amplio is something entirely different than the Communist Party. The Communist Party is an old party. The Frente Amplio is a new alliance of these people who think they know everything about Chile, but most of them are very highly educated young people who have lost kind of touch with society. For example, they don't know how to talk to the workers anymore. They're like these typical champagne socialists. I think that's a bit of the problem of Boric. But on the same side, right now, for the second round, he needs the support of the center-left, which means he needs to make some changes to his political program, which will possibly infuriate the Communist Party. So you've got here Boric, who needs to keep everyone happy, the center-left, the bit farther left, and the Communist Party. Also Christian Democrats, which is a very important party still in Chile, despite all the disappointing elections they had in recent years. Many of them, or at least a portion, will go for Cast before Boric. So for Boric to change his program in 3-4 weeks, to be able to call all those voters on the left and the center to him, and maybe to convince those who voted Parisi, And also those, and that's of course a very important portion, the people that never vote. Because if you look at recent elections in Chile, only 50% of the people vote. There's a very big number of Chileans that just either doesn't care or doesn't know how to vote or has lost complete confidence in politicians. And Boric is not the type of politician that is known to gain trust of his voters, because he has had a part in some shaky, for example, the anti-barricade law after the protests where he voted for, which basically meant that a lot of protesters who were protesting on the street went to jail. Those things are stains on the Boric legacy. So it becomes very difficult for Boric to convince all of these people in 3 weeks and make changes to his political program, while Kast, he doesn't need to change that much. His base is quite loyal, and the right wing will go vote in every election. It's what they always do. So it's not what I want. It's being very realistic. I think it's going to be very hard for Boric to become the next president of Chile.
Can I just come in there and just direct on the back of this observation, which I think is, you know, a very good one. And there's a question here from the Chile Solidarity Network, which is, isn't the challenge to convert the abstain to vote? And who are these? What is this constituency? I think Roberto spoke a little bit about who they represent. So, I mean, I'd like to ask Melanie about this and perhaps about the observations about Boric's predicament, I guess, whether she agrees that he's failed to maybe speak the language of the masses in Chile, and if this is something that can be remedied, and if it can be remedied, does it risk losing the center vote that he also needs? So if we'd start with Melanie.
Is this a question to me?
Sorry, there you go.
Melanie.
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to think about a coherent population in the country. First of all, another interesting division that came out of this election is the regional one. I mean, Parisi, which was the third, the candidate that came out third, won in most parts of the north, that north of Chile, which is the minor sector. It is the where the economy grows. The large important part of the economy is held in the north. Historically, a much more left-wing or a traditional left-wing part of the country, very much connected to the traditional left, for example, the Christian Democrats, Socialist Party. I mean, in fact, Provoste, which is the Christian Democrat that came, I think she came last fifth, fifth, right? She's member of parliament in the north, and I don't think she came out, she didn't do very well in her own region, and Parisi did very well. And then we have in the north the division of the classic vote of the right, which is thus less surprising that Kast won in the landlordship and the landlord sector, and that with all the agriculture economy is. So in the center, as traditionally kind of hold the majority of the population, and Boric won in those places. So it is very hard for me to talk about one mass population, one voter, because the necessities are so different across the country. And I think they are very clear so far, very, very clear narratives that have come out from the social movement that I think Boric has the opportunity to continue pushing, and these are the crisis of pensions, the crisis of water, and perhaps if he reinvent or kind of sort of introduce a better narrative around crime and security. I think those three narratives could allow him to engage the disengaged, perhaps. But I agree with what Roberto and Boris are saying here. It is really hard, and it is very unlikely, if we look at the numbers, that he will be able to capture that. Now, in terms of the language that he uses and who he's appealing to, yes, of course, there's still much of an attachment to the student movement. I mean, I was part of that generation when we were in 2011. I was at university back in Chile, so. And I remember her very well from that period. And Yes, he hasn't sort of, I mean, it was a bit of the problem of his speech on Sunday. He still spoke much of the language of university language, for example, which perhaps is not very appealing for other people in the country. So maybe that distance is creating problems in the way he speaks to the rest of the country. Why crime and no poverty is said in the chat? I think because crime is security more than crime. I think people are very, especially in poor neighborhoods, we see an increase of demand for better security. And that is obviously connected to conditions, material conditions, and social economic conditions. And I think the left has an opportunity to readdress that question without falling into the law and order traditional narrative that has characterized the right and that has been so successful for Kast since he became candidate, because he has been using the fear of crime, the fear of the conflict in the south of Chile with the indigenous people as a tool to massify this fear across the country. And that has been very successful for him. But again, it's really hard to tell how the elections will go on the 19th. It's going to be very close for sure.
Thanks, Melanie. There's loads of questions, well, loads. There's a number of questions coming in. I see that Victor Figueroa Clark, who's one of our contributing editors and who wrote an excellent article last year that we'll put a link up to, released by the Progressive International. He asked the question, I'm going to direct it at Roberto. He's asking how far the constitutional process might influence the vote. If Boris puts himself up as the candidate of this, would it help?
So yeah, I'm unmuted now. There should be definitely a connection between two processes that are following through different kind of tracks in Chile, but are extremely important because the last results for the elections of the Constitutional Convention basically reproduce more or less similarly to the approval versus the rejection of the Constitutional Convention elections that happened a little bit earlier. Now, that is very different from the presidential elections we've just had. Why is that? I think that remember one thing, in order for you to present presidential candidates, you have to have political parties formed. You cannot submit, I'm going to show you shortly a little diagram of the deputies, the elections to the Senate it is only the parties of the previous establishment that have the machinery to present candidates everywhere around the country. Whereas the Constitutional Assembly, it was possible for the first time to have gender parity, which in fact favor women. I mean, women had to make a correction because they were better represented even without any kind of leveling up between. And secondly, the indigenous population was represented in the Constitutional Assembly. Now, the deliberations in the Constitutional Assembly are going to be very important for the medium to long term of Chile. But they will be influenced in some ways by who is in government, because we have seen that the government, even Piñera's government, has tried to interfere with the Constitutional Assembly. For example, at the very start of the Constitutional Assembly, they didn't provide all the infrastructure that was necessary for them to begin having deliberations and making things difficult. And the fact that the right does not have the right of veto in the Constitutional Assembly is a very important point. But any government that has a very progressive program that links directly with the things that are going to come out of the Constitutional Assembly is going to be limited by the results of the parliamentary elections in Chile, which puts a limit to what any government can do, of the right or of the left. So it's going to be a period, an interregnum, when nobody is going to be able to follow its program to completion. and the interaction between the Constitutional Assembly is going to, and the government is going to be a difficult one. I just want to show, if I can share my screen with the result of the, sorry, let me just go back. Because what I want to show is that, let me see if I can share the screen. It's not working. Well, basically, I can summarize what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say is that it is the center vote that has collapsed when you look at the elections of Parliament and Senate. It is the Christian Democrat, the Socialist Party, the PPD, the center left coalition that ruled Chile that has collapsed. The left has increased its vote. The left that includes the Frente Amplio and the Communist Party. The Communist Party has gone to Senate for the first time. It's got 2 senators. And this has not happened since the government of Salvador Allende. I mean, it's a very, very long period of absence from the higher house of Parliament. So on the other hand, the right also has had a pretty good showing, but it is the traditional right and the new insurgent right that is represented by CAST. So I just want to say that in reality, it is the collapse of the center and the increased polarization between left and right that is going to be the things for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Boris, I want to ask you about the media, given that you're a journalist in Chile and you've got a website. How important has the media been, the dominant media? I mean, tell us a little bit about their motivations, their loyalties, and the role they've played in perhaps during the election, but in also covering other issues, such as someone asked about, that we haven't mentioned, the issue of immigration, which CAST has exploited during his campaign. For example, how has the media reported that? Have they fanned the flames of anti-migrant sentiment, as the media does in the UK and elsewhere? Or tell us a little bit about the Chilean media.
Well, El Mercurio miente. That's, of course, the famous line everyone says about the biggest newspaper in Chile, and that's still the case. I mean, if you would look at El Mercurio's coverage on Chile, it's letting all the thinkers and philosophers on the right wing say whatever they want and being quite critical about everything that happens on the left. But what I do see in recent years is that media, also thanks to social media, especially since the estallido, has very much diversified. So there's a lot of new media in Chile where people go to. It's not anymore that it's just El Mercurio and La Tercera that decides what people should read. There's a lot of other news, and that gives hope. So there's still a lot of outlets who, especially on things like the Mapuche conflict in the south, of migration, have an editorial line which is completely biased. But on the other side, I feel like, for example, I'm a big fan of Cooperativa. I think it's a website doing a very good job. There are, of course, new investigative platforms like CIPER, who are not only investigating right-wing, they also look at, for example, recently the Karina Oliva case, also look at things that happen on the left. So there is independent media doing a great job, but still, if you look at, for example, television, which is, of course, very influential still in Chile, there's still a lot of airtime to people that shouldn't be given airtime, especially if you look at Mega or TVN. But I prefer to look at influential journalists like Matamala, Monica Rincon. Also, they've taken a role recently on social media. They have a lot of followers, for example, on Twitter. Daniel Matamala has over 1 million followers. And you see that they are very much aware of the danger Chile is facing with a CAST presidency. Like, they're really critical on him. If you look at, for example, the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil or the United States, journalists were quite scared to say this is a fascist or this is a danger. And You see that people like Matamala, they're not scared anymore to actually say what's going on. So this is a good thing. This also reflects during the debates. You see, for example, recently in the last debate for the first round of the elections, Macarena Alvarez, if I'm correct her name, she really was really hard on Kast on the fact that he wasn't even aware of what his political program was. So you have journalists and you have channels, also thanks to social media, coming up and being more critical towards the right, and not because they're biased or because they're left-wing, just because they're following the facts. If you follow the facts in Chile, you need to be very critical on the right. So that's a good thing. So everyone who lives in Chile, I would very much urge them to support outlets like CIPER. But still, of course, there is a very big group of people in Chile who follow Mega, who watch TVN, who read El Mercurio. In that bubble, you're just gonna think that Boric is the worst that can happen to Chile and that Kast is like some savior after years of violence. So nothing new there. But there is hope when it comes to media in Chile. I really see a lot of improvement recently.
I think there were a couple of questions on the chat about how Boric, if he were to win the presidency, what kind of difficulties he'd face governing due to the way in which the parliament is fragmented, which I think Roberto answered quite well. But we've also got a question from Mike Gatehouse who says, we've focused on the difficulties of Boric, but what about Kast? Isn't he the most far right-wing candidate ever in Chile? Astonishingly extreme. And I'm not sure, am I right in thinking he's actually insinuated he might actually just ignore some of those decisions taken by Parliament, or has that been blown out of context? Melanie, do you know, what do you think about Kast? How would he face the same difficulties governing as Boric in terms of the Parliament, or is it, as has been reported, that he might just bypass Parliament totally?
No, I think he will have a worse time than Piñera is having in these last 4 years, simply because it will definitely activate a second round of uprising and unrest in the country. I mean, that will have terrible consequences for Chileans, because we will see another massacre as we saw in the last uprising. But he will not have a easy time to govern. He will have a great opposition still in Parliament, with, as Roberto was saying, with the enter of more communist representation in Parliament, both cameras. But as the question is also placed in the chat, I think one of his weaknesses is that he's perhaps too conservative. And perhaps that's the only thing that we have in hand. Chile's tradition is still a very traditional society, still very conservative in many places, but where the most population is concentrated, so where the majority of votes are, is a very liberal society. And I will dare to say we are probably one of the most liberal countries in South America. In terms of like not out of elites and legislation, but younger people are way more open than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So I think there is a bit of fear that some civil rights will be reverted if he get elected, especially related to women and women's rights, sorry. And perhaps there will be some weakness there to look at. Someone was asking as well, what about the feminist movement and how they have articulated such an important movement since 2018 with the sexual harassment at universities that became one of the biggest protests in the history of the country. And I think they have a role to play, sorry, but I don't know if it's going to be significant enough to win this election. I think this is going to be a continuous conflict. We're going to see this is a completely reconfiguration of the political landscape. If whoever wins in December, politics are not going to look the same, political parties are not going to stay the same, and social movements are not going to go away. So these movements that have been growing in the last 5-6 years, especially since the student movement and everything that came out from that, are not going to go away. So whoever is in power will have to still deal with these actors. So yeah, it is. I think there is a weakness in it, but we have to. We see if he can lose the election, but we'll see.
Roberto, do you have anything you'd like to add on that? You spoke a little bit about how the difficulties for Boric. Do you think there'd be any difficulties for Kast in the same way? Well, I think you're still on mute.
All right. I definitely agree with what Melanie just said, and I think that it's going to be difficult for either candidate to rule because of the problems in parliament, and in the case of Kast, because the people's rebellion will be kind of start again if he carries on with his program, particularly in relation to pensions, particularly in relation to student debt, which is a very strongly felt thing that came from the 2011 student uprising and resulted in a moderate kind of reform that resulted in free education for the poorest people. But if he does try and kind of reduce the size of the state, as he says, that that's going to result in social programs being downscaled, and that's going to trigger a reaction from people. Now, what I wanted to say, it's the difficulty for Boric to win. I think Boric can win the election where he able to transcend his student style of doing politics. Because remember one thing, the type of population that is more persuadable is usually the older people, because the younger people, some of them are very angry and don't trust any politicians. The older people, particularly the people who live through the dictatorship but are poor and live in the neighborhoods and say, look, it's hard for me to go and vote, you know, because, you know, as you saw in the last election, there was a certain degree of manipulation because some of the booths were closed before people stopped voting. And, you know, we are in summer and a lot of long lines in the sunshine, you know, it's hard. So if you're going to persuade, but in order to do that, you need to use other means other than Twitter and social media, because these people are not adept to social media. And this goes also for the large swathes of the south of Chile in the countryside, in particular. I wouldn't include the north because apparently Parisi, who has used exclusively social media to disseminate his message, managed to get quite a decent vote there. But I'm saying that we need to bring the vote from those people who should. I think that Kast probably has reached his ceiling, particularly if the center-right votes for him. Even with that, is still very close to 50%, and it's not going to be. Whereas a lot of the people, particularly in Santiago, which numerically, Santiago and Valparaiso are numerically the largest electoral mass in the country, and the poblaciones, the poor neighborhoods, still. The level of abstention is still too high, and it would favor Boric if they were persuaded that he would carry out the changes that people from the Estallido wanted.
Thanks, Roberto. Boris, there's an interesting question here on, well, we've got a few interesting questions on Kast, actually. Patrick Black asks, to what extent is Kast linked and associated with the corruption of Piñera and the Pinochet dictatorship? So, because I think it's been mentioned that actually the centre-right has actually, if I'm not mistaken, platformed him. I think they went into coalition, did they not, when it came to the Constitutional Convention? So, to what extent is the kind of traditional right responsible for his rise? And also, you know, is that a good thing for Kast, like Patrick's asking, or is that going to work against him ultimately, considering he's trying to position himself a bit as kind of like an anti-establishment right-wing candidate? Boris, I don't know, maybe would you like to come in on that?
Well, it's very interesting the way how the whole concept of anti-establishment politicians work. You see it right now with Boric as well. I mean, his whole program was focused on transforming, and the only thing he does right now is trying to get the votes of the center left. So at the end, his whole program turns social democrat, and he's looking for the Concertación to get elected. On the point of Kast getting all the support from the Chile Vamos coalition right now, which is the Evópoli, Renovación Nacional, and the UDI. Of course, they were going to support Kast, and the fact that they are doing so also only shows that the right has never changed. All the sentiments that are helping Kast right now grow have always been there in Chile. I mean, he's just a more extreme version of the UDI and of the right wing that has been there. And this is like Roberto said, it's just a counter-revolution, what we are seeing here in Chile. It's just something that we all could expect, and not only here in Chile. I mean, he is not a Bolsonaro, but he has a lot of similarities with Bolsonaro. And there are many countries in the world. If you look at Hungary, for example, or if you look at the United States, where these authoritarian leaders are rising. So it's more a global phenomenon. And this is also why I think it will be so hard for Boric to win, because it's just basically looking at what happened in other countries. I mean, of course, the difference in Chile are the protests and the Constitutional Convention. That's like the main difference with other countries. But apart from this, every country had, like Brazil, like massive protests with violence. And it's that last thing, the violence, that makes the people are now voting for Kast. They want tranquility, they want stability. And I saw someone, I think, in the chat also referring to the energy during the 2019 protest. Well, that energy is kind of gone. And that's also because politicians have taken the movement. And that was something that needed to happen, of course, because at some point you need to channel all those demands into political proposals, and that's what Boric has been trying to do. But at the same time, Boric needs to condone the violence on the streets. So Boric in that situation is in a very hard position, while Kast, the only thing they can get him on is his ties to the dictatorship and his past with the dictatorship. And people are trying to, like recently with the Foreign Press meeting, he said that the dictatorship of Pinochet was not that bad as Nicaragua or Venezuela. But apparently there are many people here in Chile who don't even care if a guy like Kast says that. So this is why I was saying in the beginning, for Kast it's a lot easier, this whole campaign, because he can even have such outspouts as talking about Pinochet, or right now he has some abuses on his party that he kicked out. I mean, he can have these errors. For Boric, it's just so much harder to convince the enormous variety of voters on the left.
Do you think he has managed to, and I think this will have to be the last question if we're going to wrap up soon, but so there's a question again from the Chile Solidarity Network. Chile is traditionally conservative. Allende only got 43% of the vote. Shouldn't Boric be caught in the proper left vote? Those that took part in the estallido. I think that's an interesting question, because how effective do you think Boric has been in terms of, you know, like you said, translating that protest kind of movement, or gaining its trust in a way? Do you think that he can count on all of the people who took part in the estallido, or do you think there's a large part of people who took part who won't vote for Boric, who aren't convinced by him? Will they do so if they think that the other alternative is Kast, you know, potentially fascistic?
It's interesting. A lot of people, what a lot of people are doing these days is comparing the vote that's coming up with the apruebo rechazo vote last year. and they say, no, but 80% of the people voted Apruebo, so right now all these people should vote Boris. But it's very important to remember, first of all, only 53%, I think, of the people voted in the referendum, so the turnout wasn't even that much bigger than in other elections. Second of all, a lot of people on the center-right also voted for Apruebo. It was not only a vote of left against right. Over the country marching, who all saw that this system was kind of, yeah. But what happened after, the protests continued for too long. People were kind of fed up with the violence, and the pandemic changed a lot for the people in economic aspects. Like a lot of people had problems of feeding their families and everything. And then you have Kast, who promises to continue with this model of the Chicago Boys, which of course brought a lot of people, a lot of poverty and inequality, but also brought a lot of economic growth to Chile. So people are just focusing on that, and I think you know what, we prefer to go back to the years of stability, which was of course stability for only a few in Chile. Then opting for Kast, who is promising his transformation, which might mean more revolution. And another thing, which is very clever by Kast and all the media behind him, he is focusing this like a battle against communism. So a lot of people here, especially the elder generations, are still very traumatized with what happened during the dictatorship. So they think, okay, so if the communists get to power, maybe we get another coup and we get back to the torture. They fear. So it's, as someone wrote in the chat, is hope against fear, this election, and it's completely true. But in a traumatized country like Chile, people in the end might opt for fear, while they know that hope is the better option, but just out of fear for what might happen when people come to power, who have, for example, the army or right-wing people as their opponents.
Thanks, Boris. It's I think it's clear it's certainly going to be a nail-biting, to say the least, second round of presidential elections in December. Melanie, have you got any final remarks that you'd like to make?
Yeah, I mean, there's been lots of interesting questions in the chat, so thank you for everybody to engage in so well with the conversation. Obviously, there's so many things we couldn't address in such an hour or so, obviously, but I guess yeah, I want to address what also Boris was saying. It's definitely going to be hard for Gabriel to win this election, in my opinion, but I think this is a very special scenario. I mean, we haven't seen someone coming out second, winning the election in the second round since Lagos and Lavín. But this is not Lagos and Lavín. This is a very different combination of politics, social movements that are also very much engaged in this process. So I think it's going to be very, very close, whoever wins. And what is very important is that to understand that whoever wins, this is going to be a transition government, because this is what is more important in the background at the moment is the convention, the new constitution, and what is going to happen after this new constitution is written and we have to vote again in a referendum, the exit referendum as they call it. I think this is what is more important. This is going to be a transition government. And after that, we're going to have a very potentially we could have a very different country. So yeah, I mean, obviously the hope is that Boric makes it on the 19th of December, but we're going to be watching. Me, finally, I'm going to be there to be in an election for many, many years for the first time.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, no, there've definitely been some interesting questions in the chat tonight, so thank you to everyone there. Roberto, how would you like to close this discussion? What are your thoughts on everything we've talked about?
co-speakers have done a marvelous job, so I agree with the general comments. I think it's difficult really to predict what's going to happen, and as I just want to reiterate something, because I'm obviously much older than my co-speakers, and I want to kind of bring in the issue of how to reach those voters that can make the difference to the election. I think the right-wing old voters of my generation have already made up their mind for Cast and will vote for Cast in the second half. But there will be a lot of people who are still disillusioned from my generation and obviously from younger generations, but I'm just going to concentrate on my generation because how can you reach them? And I think this is where you're going to have, it's going to be a very hard thing, because as Boris and Melanie have said, Gabriel Boric has a very hard act to follow, because he has to move his program to the center, which would alienate some of the people who feel that none of the changes that are needed have been happening and will probably blame him into selling out. But those are the precise voters that he needs to appeal to, because numerically, I mean, with 40, 50 something % of the population not voting, it is a small percentage increase in the voting of the poorer sectors that won't change in Chile. The people that voted for those members of the Constituent Assembly in last year would make a difference. So all I'm saying is, I hope that the circle can be kind of, you know, that we can actually, how is it you say, square the circle or something the other way around? I don't remember. But this is a very difficult thing to do. But I really have hopes that we can mobilize the vote that didn't come out in the first part of the presidential election.
Okay, and with that, we're going to bring this event to a close. We've gone a little bit over, but we like to be disciplined with our timekeeping. So I just want to thank all three speakers, Boris, Melanie, and Roberto, for a really fascinating discussion that touched on so many of the key issues that are at play in the run-up to the 19th. Thank you also to all the people that contributed to the chat. It really is. There's a lot of very useful and important information there. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. I know there were many that we didn't get to. I want to say that, yeah, I mean, we will be putting a recording of this on our website in a couple of days. And so look out for that, do share it, because yeah, the Chilean elections is, you know, what's coming up on the 19th is important, not just for Chile, but for the region and for left politics around the world and for right politics around the world. So yeah, thank you for taking part. Also want to plug the Santiago Rising film by Alborado's co-editor Nick McWilliam, that many of you whose names I recognize have seen, I know. But if you haven't seen it, we're doing online screenings this weekend and next weekend, and the information is on our website. Perhaps someone can put, here we go. It's a really great film by Nick that really captures some of that energy of the street and the kind of that fusion of kind of politics, you know, kind of uprising politics and culture and that really hopeful moment in Chile that is under threat with the election of Cast. So thanks a lot. I think Nick's gonna put some of his excellent playlist on, so we can have 5 or 10 minutes of Chilean music. And yeah, thank you, and see you at a future Alborada event. Thank you.